Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is the Yukitsu Times. Welcome to my channel, welcome to another game of Company Heroes, and we're going to be talking a little bit in this particular case about a topic that I think is pretty well known to most people, and that's power creep. So, for those of you who don't know what it is, which I'm pretty sure most of you do, but just in case, power creep is sort of the tendency for games to add expansion and additions to content that are more powerful than the original content or the previous content to it. So, a good example of this would be, collectible card games, and I don't actually play very many of them, but in a certain extent, they've got a reputation that new card packs and new series are going to come out with mechanics and new abilities that make them more powerful than previous cards. And so the new cards sort of are more powerful, and this tendency tends to creep upwards. That's why it's called power creep, essentially. So, that's what that is. It's not really a negative thing per se. It's not necessarily the most positive of things either, but there are some points to it. There are some good points to power creep. I can't really say there isn't. One of the best things about power creep is that in a game like, say a collectible card game, adding new expansions that have very powerful cards can really shake up the metagame, the way that it's played. The way that people play the game starts to stagnate after a certain amount of time. It remains identical. In a game like StarCraft or in other RTSs, this is also true. The meta becomes stale after a certain period of time where people have figured out what is optimal and basically just play based on that. And you want to make sure that people are doing something new. To do this, you need something that is powerful enough to shake away the current most powerful things. So if we were to talk about, say, League of Legends, to change it from the current 80 carry standard in bottom lane with the support, you would have to do something that dramatically shook that up, that made you something else more powerful than that option of a late game hyper carry that is safely farming behind their support. Of course, they're trying to do this with Mordekaiser, I suspect, or at least that's people's suspicion about that issue, but whether or not that's going to ultimately be successful in changing the metagame is still to be seen, of course. But I'm pretty sure that a lot of people have already seen some success with that. The problem is that Mordekaiser will probably get nerfed. So this is the other thing about power creep, is that it's not always permanent. People who are the developers will try to change and shake up the meta, but they aren't necessarily going to like the results. They're going to sometimes nerf things back down to the status quo. Either way, in this particular case, in Relic's case, they've got a notorious reputation for sort of power creep in their games. It hasn't necessarily hit Company of Heroes 2 yet, but it really was prevalent in Dawn of War more so than anything else. And I think that to a very large extent, this is probably moving in the same sort of direction as that. I mean, the Americans did feel more powerful than the Soviets. The OKW did feel like they were a little bit more powerful, but pretty similar to the Wehrmacht. I would actually say that the OKW were pretty much the same, but the Americans were more powerful than the Russians. And the British feel more powerful, again, than the Americans or the Russians. So there is definitely some sense that, at least on the Allied side of things are getting stronger than the original release with the Russians. And I'm not really sure why that is, but it definitely does feel like that is the trend. So part of this is because the British just have a very different sort of approach to the game, to the battle. I would actually argue that it's because the British play a lot and have a lot of similar strengths to the Wehrmacht, which is probably the strongest faction under most circumstances in this game. So the fact that they're now sort of a faction that's on par-ish with the Wehrmacht on the Allied side means that they're ludicrously broken, basically. Yeah. You can see that this over here. Unfortunately, this does get taken out, but the Universal Carrier with the Flamethrower is one of the biggest reasons why I think the British are extremely strong. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're overpowered, but that ability to just take out all those machine guns that I did in such quick order is such a strong ability, and it's such a strong unit for how early you can get it, because you can get that astonishingly early. Now, the British, I do think, are going to get nerfed a little bit, but I still do think that at this current point in time, they are probably the strongest Allied faction by a little bit. They've got such strong responses to a lot of things that the Germans can put out, and like I said, this is going to shake up the way the game is played to a certain degree. The Germans are going to have to figure out how to adapt to the British with the new abilities that they happen to have and the new stuff that they have, and all of that other good stuff is going to change in ways that are probably positive to the game as a whole. But at the same time, this doesn't really do anything to help the Americans or the Russians. Their metagame is going to remain as it is, so there is a little bit wonky about the method that they're using to shake up the metagame. Rather than adding things to existing things, they're adding an entire new faction. That's usually not the best way to do it. The way that you can see this best is actually in the Total War games, where they'll add faction packs constantly, pretty consistently to the game. It's just that the faction packs don't really do anything. The factions that they add in those packs are usually weaker than the basic ones, or they just don't really make a difference. A good example of this, in Shogun 2, they entirely didn't matter, just because you always basically had the same factions no matter what, and most people played Avatar battles anyway, so it didn't really matter what people were doing as far as the Otomo, for example, or the Hattori or whatever. And then Fall of the Samurai was the same thing. If I was playing the classical armies, it was pretty easy for me to beat a Fall of the Samurai army, although a lot of people argued otherwise. I actually thought it was easier to use a historical army rather than a Fall of the Samurai army, or sorry, a medieval army rather than a modern army. They just felt stronger, but, I think there's some variance in that. Still, there's definitely that sort of sense that the power creep in their games comes from patches. In Total War, if you're playing along, usually they're going to introduce a patch that breaks something in the game, that makes something ridiculously too strong, such as, a good example of that would be when they patched it so that the heavy swords became the king of everything in Rome 2, and now they basically just roam everywhere. The intermediate cost heavy swords are basically all you see in Rome. That was because of patches. That was not because of expansions. In fact, the most powerful faction in that game now is Rome. One of the titular original faction. And that's sort of also the case in Attila, last I recall. I can't really remember for sure. I think Rome was one of the Eastern Rome was, I think, one of the really, really strong factions just because they had really good cavalry. But I think some patches also nerfed them. I can't really remember for sure. So, there's that advantage to that system. And Relic's system of introducing DLCs to this is not the best one, because it makes it feel a little bit pay to win. It would have been much better if they added in new content for the Russians and for the Americans that made them work in completely different ways than before, because that would make the German players adapt. As it is, they don't have to adapt to the Russians, they don't have to adapt to the Americans anymore. All they have to do is just play differently when they're playing against the British. So it kind of is like they're adapting, but not really, ultimately. And here you can sort of see some of the effects of the British early game. This was, to a large degree, the early game, and I have not felt that sort of weakness that is supposed to be baked into the British early game. To a very large extent, I'm doing quite well, actually. You can see that my opponent is not really ahead on anything other than, capture points to a certain extent. Although, yeah, I'm still currently ahead of capture points just because I got an early lead on those. But, I mean, in terms of points, I've got more points usually. I'm getting more resources. My resource income is quite a bit higher than his, honestly. And, of course, that's part of OKW, but at the same time, he's bleeding manpower quite quickly. I've got smaller, stronger units, and that's sort of the way things happen to be. So, I mean, am I stronger than if I was playing as the Russians? I think I am. I think that is definitely the case here, and there may be a case where that's not actually true, but I mean, it definitely feels as though that were true.
Flares prepped. High explosive phosphorus mortar rounds ready to fire.
Yeah. One of the things I need to do is actually fire more of those creeping smoke barrages, because they are actually phosphorus. So, the white phosphorus is actually a very deadly thing to land on top of an enemy unit. So, yeah, I mean, watch out when you're buying this game, and any game from Relic in particular are pretty notorious for this, or look at how they're going to probably grow as a game when you're buying something like this, because they are going to always do it this way. And I feel like that if you are willing and understand what the investment is going to be when you play one of these games, or if you just don't care and you just plan on playing it for a few months and then not playing it anymore, these are actually really good games, and I like playing them, so there's no way I would stop necessarily. I wouldn't stop buying their games. It's just that you'd have to be careful about what you're doing with them, because they are going to continue this trend of adding in expansions. They are going to continue this trend of changing up the content, they're going to continue with this trend for forever, basically. And I think that that is fine. That's how they've chosen to monetize their game. That's how they've chosen to have things set up. And that is, you know, their choice. That's their prerogative. And I don't think there's anything really for saying they should do it a different way. It's just, you know, be aware of what you're getting yourself into. You will end up being very, very frustrated if you're playing this game, playing the original factions, and find yourself, you know, suddenly stuck against something that is much, much stronger than what you'd originally started with. Commandos. My commandos did not do particularly well this game, but whatever. I lost my Cromwell, but got a Churchill, so, you know, my Cromwell has evolved into a Churchill. Anyway, yeah, tell me what you think about power creep. And whether, you know, it's good or bad. I'm assuming everyone thinks that's always bad. That's kind of the impression that I get from a lot of things. But, you know, I think in moderation and done in the correct way, it actually is a good thing to a certain extent. Not necessarily a good thing, but it's not harmful. I don't remember if I'm hitting this damn thing with artillery or not, but in any event, we are over here. If you're wondering, this is what I'm doing with the Churchill. It's just powerful enough to take the hits from this Panzer Schwerer and destroy it. Yep, not a whole lot they could do about that. Anyway, yeah. I mean, that's the thing about this this game, though. It's always one of those ones where you aren't sure if something's overpowered until you've tried it quite a lot. And I don't know if I played enough of the British to say definitively they are overpowered or not. I don't think that that's going to happen for a little while. Here you can see some good hits from him, but he is actually going to be able to take up my Cromwell, or my Churchill rather. And that unit has to retreat, which is bad. I do wipe a unit, which is good, but fortunately for me, I've got plenty of fuel and I can replace that Churchill pretty easily, so. Unfortunately, this unit pinned. I have to retreat here. I had this unit attacking this stupid building over here. We're going to take that out later. Either way. Yeah. So, do I like the British in this game? Yes, I do. I think that, to a certain extent, the Germans have been a little bit more powerful than the Americans and the Russians. Not as much so lately, necessarily, but I definitely do feel that the balance is a little bit off. The British ended up just playing a lot like the Germans, to a certain extent, I feel. I feel like they've got a lot of the strengths and not necessarily as many strengths as them. Like, they don't have the ridiculous heavy tanks. The Churchill's ridiculous in its own sort of way, but it's not as ridiculous as the Tiger, because the Tiger can actually kill everything. So, you know, I definitely feel as though there is something to say for the British not being actually that broken necessarily. I think that's just that they're a lot more like the Germans. And the German players are not used to playing against the Germans. They're used to playing against things like the Russians or the Americans, which have a very hard time with their infantry to a certain degree. Because when you're playing this game, it always definitely feels as though the Russian infantry tends to lose pretty badly against the German infantry, and the American infantry also tends to lose against the German infantry. That is definitely not the case with the British infantry. The British infantry tends to tank through things like champs. Or rather, I should say that the Russians and the Americans don't have durable infantry. That's really the thing. So you can use a couple things like mortars or whatever. Like, you can see these infantry guns trying to pound away at my units here. And I'm getting away with just, like, really high numbers and really low health, because these British units are extremely durable, especially at veterancy 2. They're going to be very, very hard for them to kill anything. It's just that they will cause some damage to them. I think that a lot of German players aren't necessarily used to that, because the British don't actually have better than German durability. Their units have about as many hit points and as much armor as Germans, typically. But, you know, because of that, a lot of the German players are, I think, very used to their unit blobs running up and immediately causing casualties, and that's how they stop themselves from getting killed, and that's why they sort of blob up so much. The British aren't really like that. The British are very much a faction that plays a lot like the Germans themselves, and I think that that's sort of where the imbalance idea comes from. I'll have to check more on that and play a little bit more comparison, cross-comparison sort of thing. Either way, though, here you can see another Volksgren blob. They're shooting at my Churchill. which means they're going to accomplish very little. Here's an interesting call-in. This is the air supremacy operation. So I thought that this unit was safe because I did not know the radius of this. Yeah.
An emplacement is being attacked.
This is the radius of it. This is the radius of the air supremacy operation. Okay, that is kind of ridiculous. I can afford those pretty easily. It's 325. I'm floating just tons of munitions. Anyway, yeah, so I definitely get the feeling that, you know, there is going to be another faction that comes out that's going to be stronger than all the other ones that have come out so far. I don't think that there's any real doubt about that. What does matter is whether or not it's going to be like Dawn of War, where they produce a faction that's so ridiculously overpowered that it just ruins the game for people. Because that's what Necrons did to Dawn of War. And Relic, I think, got a bit of a reputation for power creep being extremely bad because of that. So we're just about to the end of this game here. We've got ourselves an enemy Panther. Let's just wrap up by talking about the game itself here a little bit. So yeah, at this point in time, I mean, I've produced 2 Churchills and 2 Cromwells. I mean, I've still got more gas than my opponent, even though I've lost a Churchill and a Cromwell. All he's lost is a Panzer II, basically. So yeah, I mean, the gas efficiency of the British is kind of silly, actually. I think that almost maybe too efficient to a certain extent. I mean, it's 175 for that Panzer, for the Tiger, or sorry, for the Panther here. It's like 135 for a Panzer IV, which is a lot more than a Cromwell. The Cromwell's 110, and a Cromwell will beat a Panzer IV, so, you know, that's kind of the way that the state is currently. The British are just extremely gas efficient, they're extremely manpower inefficient, so if you can keep your units alive as the British, you're not spending manpower, you just don't have to. Like, look at all these units at, like, such low health. This unit of engineers is at half health, but they've still got 4 members. They're at less than half health, they're still full, 4 people. I mean, if you can get your units to be coming back home like that, where they've taken huge damage but no casualties, you're just going to win a lot of games, because you're going to end up with a huge amount of manpower. You're going to end up with just tons of it, and you're going to be able to spend the rest of your resources on very gas-efficient tanks and vehicles, and very expensive call-ins. Like, look at this. My munitions call-in for this is just, yeah, it's fantastic. So, that's kind of the state of the game here. Over here, you know, my opponent basically gives up at this point in time, and you can see that, you know, that has ended because my Churchill has come around here and is starting to attack these things. Now, do I think that the British are probably going to get nerfed? Actually, I think they probably will get a little bit nerfed. There are some elements of them that are definitely a little bit too strong, especially the Universal Carrier, making their early game kind of ludicrously good. But all in all, I think that, yeah, this is going to be an indicator of things to come, I suspect. If there's ever an Italian army that comes out, if there's ever a Japanese army that comes out, I can expect them to actually be really dominant and really overpowered in a way that might be harmful to the game. Yeah, I'm especially worried if they ever did a Japan, because the only way they could make Japan work is if they had a ludicrous early game. They have no late game armor, the Japanese, because they didn't have any tanks in World War II that were able to stand up even to a Sherman. And the Sherman was kind of the Pee-wee Herman of, or sorry, the puny tank of the Western Front. Imagine what that's going to be like when they're fighting against things like the goddamn Churchill. They're just not going to have a chance. So the only way the Japanese would ever work in this game is if they had very, very early armor. I think it's the Type 9 or something like that. They would have used. It's very similar to the French Renault, but they had a very, very primitive type of tank that was designed for light vehicle infantry support in heavily forested terrain. So it's not the same as the wide open terrain that you saw in Africa or in Eastern Europe, or even the fields in Western Europe. So they had a definite difference in philosophy of tanks. But if they ran up against even like this Cromwell here, this could probably knock out like 5 Japanese tanks by itself. So the only way they would be able to make that faction is if they made their early game ridiculously broken, so that they would just control the entire damn map. And that has a lot of potential to be problematic in the game. So, you know, if they ever did a faction like that, it would be very, very much the death knell potentially of this game. Or they would have to make up fictional tanks for them, which I think some games would do as an alternative. But yeah, I mean, I'm still enjoying this game at the current state it is. It's not gotten to that point that Dawn of War has yet, but I think that power creep, it's definitely something that's good and bad for games, and I think that's important to keep an eye out for it. Anyway, I hope you found this video informative, and of course, as always, I hope to see you all next time.